It didn't begin with a public announcement, but with a quiet legal review buried deep within royal archives. A single phrase, flagged by auditors, sent shockwaves through palace corridors. Camilla had no legal claim. What began as routine oversight quickly unraveled into something far more explosive, an institutional reckoning that would redefine power, legacy, and entitlement at the highest level of the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it was just another internal review, one of dozens conducted quietly each year within the royal financial offices. These audits were routine, almost invisible to the public, designed to ensure that every asset, every trust, every carefully structured piece of the monarchy's vast holdings remained aligned with long-standing legal frameworks. But this time, something felt different. Reports suggest that early into the process, a discrepancy emerged, not dramatic at first glance, but unsettling enough to halt the usual rhythm of paperwork and signatures. A single notation, buried within layers of legal language, raised a question no one in that room had anticipated asking. The focus of the audit had been precise: the personal estate of Queen Elizabeth II. Not the crown estate, not the publicly understood assets tied to the monarchy as an institution, but the deeply private holdings, properties, trusts, and financial instruments accumulated over decades. These were not just possessions, they were symbols of continuity, carefully passed down through generations with deliberate intent. And yet, as auditors combed through these records, they began to notice inconsistencies in how certain assumptions had been made, particularly regarding Camilla's position. Insiders whisper that what began as a quiet clarification quickly escalated into something far more serious. The language surrounding inheritance rights, long assumed to be straightforward, suddenly appeared rigid, unforgiving even. There were no ambiguities where many had expected them, no flexible interpretations. Just a stark legal boundary that seemed to place Camilla outside the line of entitlement. Senior aides, those familiar with the monarchy's inner workings, were reportedly alarmed, not because the rules were unclear, but because they were so clear and yet had gone unquestioned for so long. As the findings circulated internally, the atmosphere within the palace began to shift. Conversations grew shorter. Meetings became more frequent, but far more controlled. There were no leaks, no public statements, no attempts to manage the narrative. Instead, there was silence, thick, deliberate, and deeply unusual. Palace aides were instructed to maintain absolute discretion, a directive that only fueled speculation among those who sensed something unfolding behind closed doors. For weeks, perhaps longer, those within the inner circle carried this knowledge quietly. Some reportedly struggled to reconcile the legal reality with the public perception that had been carefully maintained. Others, more seasoned in the quiet battles of royal protocol, recognized the implications immediately. This wasn't just about paperwork, it was about power, about legacy, about the invisible lines that define who belongs and who does not. And as tension continued to build, one question lingered in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. If this structure had always existed, why was it only now being brought to light? The answer, it seemed, was buried deeper than anyone had anticipated, waiting to be uncovered piece by piece. But what the auditors uncovered wasn't just a technicality, it was a deliberate structure, designed long before Camilla ever became queen. Long before the current crisis, Queen Elizabeth II had already written the ending. Hidden within decades-old legal frameworks and personal directives was a blueprint, one that determined exactly who would inherit what and who would not. To understand what the auditors had stumbled upon, you have to step back far beyond the present moment of tension, beyond the quiet panic unfolding in palace offices, and into the mindset of a monarch who ruled not just with authority, but with precision. Queen Elizabeth II was never careless with legacy. Reports suggest that every decision she made regarding her personal estate was deliberate, layered, and protected by structures designed to outlast not only her reign, but any future uncertainty. This was not simply about wealth. It was about control over how the monarchy would endure long after her voice had fallen silent. Those familiar with the internal workings of royal finance often point to one critical distinction, one that the public rarely understands. There is the crown estate, vast and untouchable, belonging not to the monarch personally, but to the institution itself. Then there are sovereign assets tied to the functioning of the monarchy. And finally, there is personal wealth, private, carefully guarded, and perhaps the most strategically managed of all. It was within this final category that Queen Elizabeth II exercised her greatest discretion. This is where the blueprint lived. Insiders whisper that over decades, she constructed a network of trusts and sealed directives, each one acting as a safeguard against ambiguity. These were not documents meant to be casually interpreted. They were precise, unyielding, designed to eliminate doubt. Some were said to be locked away, accessible only under strict conditions. Others were embedded within broader legal frameworks, quietly reinforcing a single, unwavering principle. Continuity must be protected at all costs. And continuity, in the House of Windsor, has always meant one thing above all else: bloodline. Not proximity, not marriage, not even status. Blood. This was not a new concept. Historical precedents stretch back generations, where inheritance followed a path that was narrow, intentional, and often unforgiving. Those who married into the family could gain influence, visibility, even power, but ownership was another matter entirely. Ownership belonged to those born within the line, those whose connection to the crown could not be altered or redefined. As the auditors continued their work, these historical patterns began to align with the present findings in ways that were impossible to ignore. What initially seemed like an inconsistency started to look more like a confirmation, evidence that the system had been working exactly as intended. And within that system, there were early indications, subtle but unmistakable, that Camilla's position had always been carefully defined and carefully limited. Various interpretations of these documents suggest that while Camilla's role as queen granted her status and visibility, it did not automatically extend into the realm of personal inheritance. The distinction was quiet, almost invisible to the outside world, but internally, it was rigid. Some insiders claim that this separation was not an oversight, but a deliberate choice, one made long before her position within the monarchy had fully solidified. And as these pieces began to come together, the narrative shifted. This was no longer about a sudden revelation. It was about a design that had been in place for years, waiting for the moment when it would finally be understood. The deeper the auditors looked, the clearer it became that nothing about this was accidental. And, as the structure became clearer, one uncomfortable truth emerged: Camilla's role may have always been symbolic, never proprietary. It came down to one line buried in legal language, but impossible to ignore. A clause that, according to royal auditors, effectively erased any assumption of entitlement. At first glance, it didn't look extraordinary. Just another passage in a dense legal framework, surrounded by paragraphs of carefully structured terminology. But, and reports suggest, the moment auditors isolated its meaning, the atmosphere shifted instantly. This was not vague wording open to interpretation. It was precise, surgical, and its implication was impossible to soften. The clause, as it was quietly understood within those walls, restricted inheritance rights in unmistakable terms, limiting them to direct blood heirs, not spouses, not consorts, not even those who had stood beside the monarch at the height of public ceremony. Bloodline, and bloodline alone. What made it even more unsettling was that this clause did not stand alone. Insiders whisper that as auditors dug deeper, they began uncovering layers of reinforcement, sealed documents, cross-reference directives, and private legal instruments that all pointed in the same direction. This was not an accidental omission. It was a pattern, a structure that had been quietly fortified over time, leaving no room for reinterpretation when the moment of transition finally arrived. Palace administrative streams, ranging from treasury whispers to discreet legal consultations, suggest that external experts were brought in but not publicly, and certainly not in a way that would attract attention. These were individuals familiar with the complexities of royal law, the kind of specialists who understand that within the monarchy, tradition often carries the weight of statute. And even among them, there was reportedly little disagreement about what the clause meant. The debates that followed were not about legality, they were about consequence. Because once the meaning became clear, the implications began to ripple outward. Advisors, some deeply embedded in the institution for decades, were forced to confront a reality that clashed sharply with public perception. For years, the image had been carefully maintained, a unified front, A seamless transition of roles, a quiet assumption that proximity to the crown carried with it a degree of entitlement. But this clause dismantled that assumption in an instant. It drew a line sharp, undeniable, and placed Camilla firmly on one side of it. Various interpretations of internal discussions describe moments of tension, even unease. As senior figures attempted to reconcile this legal reality with the expectations that had been allowed to grow over time. Some reportedly argued that interpretation could still offer flexibility. Others, more aligned with the monarchy's rigid traditions, insisted that the clause was not just clear, it was intentional, and therefore unchallengeable. And within that debate, Camilla's position began to shift, not publicly, not yet, but internally. From assumed participant to defined outsider, from perceived beneficiary to acknowledged consort. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly, as each layer of documentation confirmed the same truth. What had once seemed like a matter of status was now revealed to be something far more limited. The role of queen, in this context, did not equate to ownership. It did not grant access to the deeply protected personal estate of the monarch who came before. It was symbolic, visible, powerful in its own way, but legally separate from the assets that truly defined legacy. And as this understanding settled into the corridors of power, one unsettling thought began to take hold. If the law had always been this clear, if the structure had been so carefully constructed and consistently reinforced, then this was not a new development. It was a long-standing reality, one that had simply remained unspoken until now. But if the law was always this clear, the real question became who already knew. Behind closed doors, reactions were swift and deeply divided. Some saw it as justice, others as a looming crisis that could fracture the monarchy's delicate balance. What had begun as a quiet legal revelation now transformed into something far more volatile, an emotional and political fault line running through the very core of the royal family. Reports suggest that within hours of the clause being fully understood, urgent conversations began unfolding at the highest levels. These were not ceremonial discussions. They were tense, deliberate, and, at times, deeply personal. Because this was no longer about documents alone. It was about people, powerful figures, whose roles, loyalties, and futures were suddenly being called into question. Among those most closely watching the situation, Prince William reportedly aligned himself with a position that many insiders describe as unwavering: preservation of legacy, protection of structure, and above all, adherence to the framework left behind by Queen Elizabeth II. Those familiar with his approach suggest that for William, this was not a matter open to negotiation. The monarchy, in his view, was an institution built on continuity, and continuity demanded discipline. Any deviation, especially one tied to inheritance and entitlement, risked unraveling something far larger than a single dispute. At the same time, Princess Anne emerged, once again, as a figure of quiet authority. Insiders whisper that her stance was even more resolute, grounded not in emotion but in protocol. For Anne, there was no ambiguity to navigate, no gray area to explore. The rules existed. They had been written, reinforced, and protected over decades. And now, they were simply being recognized. Some within the palace reportedly described her approach as unyielding, even cold, but others saw it as necessary. A stabilizing force in a moment that threatened to spiral into uncertainty. But at the center of it all stood King Charles III, and for him, the situation was anything but straightforward. Reports suggest that Charles found himself caught in a deeply personal conflict, one that could not be resolved through legal clarity alone. On one side stood the legacy of his mother, the structures she had built, and the expectations of those determined to uphold them. On the other stood his wife, whose position within the monarchy was now being quietly, but undeniably, redefined. It was not just a constitutional dilemma. It was emotional, human, and, perhaps most dangerously, public in its potential consequences. Within the palace itself, the atmosphere tightened. Staff were reportedly given strict instructions: no discussions, no leaks, no acknowledgement of the situation beyond what was absolutely necessary. Silence became policy. But silence, in an environment already charged with uncertainty, only amplified the tension. Those working behind the scenes could feel the shift. Conversations were more cautious, decisions more deliberate. Every move carried weight. And as these internal dynamics unfolded, a deeper conflict began to emerge, one that went beyond individuals and reached into the very identity of the monarchy. This was no longer just about Camilla's position. It was about a fundamental question. Should the institution bend to accommodate personal relationships, or should it remain rigid, even at the cost of personal strain? The divide was subtle but unmistakable. On one side, the idea of monarchy as family. On the other, monarchy as institution. As voices grew firmer and positions more entrenched, it became clear that this issue could not remain contained within legal discussions or private conversations. The stakes were too high, the implications too far-reaching. What had started as a quiet discovery was now evolving into something far more consequential, a struggle not just over interpretation, but over control itself. As emotions intensified, the issue moved beyond legal theory and into the realm of power. For Camilla, the revelation wasn't just legal, it was deeply personal. A quiet but undeniable shift in status, one that redefined her place within the royal hierarchy. Reports suggest that the moment the findings were no longer containable within internal circles, a private briefing was arranged, carefully controlled, discreet, and delivered with the kind of restraint that often signals something far more serious beneath the surface. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public acknowledgments. Instead, what unfolded was quieter, heavier. The kind of moment that doesn't explode outward, but sinks inward, reshaping everything it touches. And for Camilla, insiders whisper, that moment carried a weight that extended far beyond legal interpretation. Because this was not simply about documents or clauses. It was about identity. For years, her position within the monarchy had evolved from outsider to accepted figure, from controversy to coronation. Publicly, the narrative had been one of gradual acceptance, even triumph. The image of unity had been carefully constructed, reinforced through appearances, statements, and the steady normalization of her role as queen. But privately, according to those familiar with the situation, this revelation introduced a fracture in that narrative, one that could not easily be repaired. The emotional implications, though never openly discussed, were reportedly profound. To be positioned at the center of the monarchy, yet simultaneously excluded from one of its most fundamental structures, created a contradiction that was difficult to ignore. It wasn't a loss in the traditional sense. Nothing had been taken away, and yet something had shifted. A realization had settled in that the role she occupied, powerful as it appeared, existed within boundaries that had been defined long before she stepped into it. This tension between perception and reality began to ripple outward. Publicly, nothing changed. The appearances continued. The language remained consistent. But insiders suggest that within royal circles, the atmosphere grew more measured, more cautious. Subtle adjustments were made, not announced, not explained, but felt. Invitations, interactions, the unspoken dynamics that shape proximity within the monarchy, all of it began to carry a slightly different tone. Not exclusion, but distance. Not rejection, but recalibration. Speculation also began to surface regarding the broader implications, particularly for those connected to Camilla beyond her role as queen. Questions emerged quietly at first, then with increasing curiosity about expectations that may have existed, and how those expectations now aligned with the reality being uncovered. There were no official statements, no confirmations, but the uncertainty itself became part of the narrative. A lingering question mark where once there had been assumption. And then, almost imperceptibly, the media began to take notice. Not through direct revelations, but through patterns. Subtle shifts in coverage, changes in tone. The kind of reporting that doesn't declare, but suggests. Observations layered with implication, hinting at something unfolding beneath the surface. It was not yet a headline, but it was no longer invisible. Through all of this, Camilla's position remained intact in the most visible sense. She was still queen, still present, still part of the institution. But the understanding of that position had changed, quietly but irreversibly. What once appeared to be a seamless integration into the monarchy's deepest structures was now revealed to be something more limited, more defined, and perhaps more fragile than previously believed. And as this realization continued to settle, it became clear that the impact of these findings would not remain confined to personal reflection or private adjustment. The implications were too significant, the questions too far-reaching. What had begun as a legal clarification was now touching every layer of the institution, challenging assumptions that had long gone unexamined. But the consequences didn't stop with Camilla. They threatened to reshape the monarchy itself. What started as a quiet audit had become something far greater, a test of the monarchy's core principles and its willingness to uphold them. Because by now, the issue could no longer be contained within private briefings or carefully managed conversations. It had expanded quietly, steadily into a question that reached the very foundation of the royal system. This was no longer just about one clause or one individual. It was about whether the monarchy would remain anchored to the principles that had sustained it for generations, or whether it would bend under the weight of modern expectations and personal complexities. Reports suggest that within senior circles, this realization carried a sense of urgency that was impossible to ignore. At the heart of this tension was a broader implication, one that extended far beyond Camilla's situation. If the legal framework truly prioritized bloodline over marriage, if it reinforced a system where inheritance followed a strict and unyielding path, then it raised a larger question. Had the monarchy always operated under rules that the public had never fully understood? And if so, what did that mean for how the institution presented itself to the world? Those familiar with royal doctrine often point to a principle that has guided the monarchy for centuries: the idea that the crown is not a personal possession, but an institution. A living structure that exists beyond any one individual, bound by rules that are designed to protect continuity above all else. This moment, according to insiders, forced that principle back into focus with striking clarity. The crown, in this context, was not a family asset to be distributed based on personal relationships. It was something far more rigid, far more controlled. And that distinction, once understood, changed everything. But with that clarity came discomfort. Public trust, long built on a perception of unity and transparency, now faced a subtle but significant challenge. Not because anything had been done incorrectly, but because the reality behind the institution was more complex, more calculated than many had assumed. The monarchy had always balanced tradition with public expectation, carefully shaping its image to maintain relevance. Now, that balance was being tested once again. Comparisons began to surface quietly at first, then with increasing frequency. Past moments of royal controversy, times when the institution had been forced to confront internal contradictions, were brought back into conversation. Each one carried its own lessons, its own consequences. And yet, this moment felt different, more controlled perhaps, more deliberate, as though the monarchy, having learned from history, was now navigating this situation with a heightened awareness of what was at stake. Internally, there was reportedly a strong push to protect something even more significant than reputation: the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II. Her decisions, her structures, her carefully constructed frameworks were not just legal instruments. They were extensions of her reign, reflections of how she believed the monarchy should endure. To alter them, to reinterpret them for convenience, would not only risk instability, it would risk undermining the very foundation she had spent decades reinforcing. And so, the focus shifted, away from personalities, away from immediate tensions, and towards something larger: stability, continuity, the quiet preservation of an institution that, despite its complexities, still carried immense symbolic weight. In a time of uncertainty, both within the monarchy and beyond, it became clear that maintaining that stability was not optional. It was essential. Because in moments like this, when personal and institutional lines begin to blur, the monarchy faces its greatest challenge not from external forces, but from within. The ability to hold firm, to resist the pull of emotion, to prioritize structure over sentiment. That is where its true strength is tested. And in the end, the resolution would not come from emotion, but from something far more enduring. In the final analysis, one principle stood above all: others' duty. Not marriage, not proximity, not expectation, just duty. By the time the full weight of the situation settled across the palace, there was a growing sense that this was never truly about individuals. Not about personalities, alliances, or even loyalties. It was about something older, something far more deeply embedded within the monarchy's identity. Reports suggest that as discussions reached their most critical point, the focus shifted away from negotiation and toward reaffirmation, a return to doctrine, a quiet but firm reminder of the rules that had always governed the institution, even when they were not openly acknowledged. For generations, the monarchy has operated under an unspoken but rigid hierarchy of values. At the top of that hierarchy sits duty unyielding, often unforgiving, but essential. It is the force that shapes decisions, defines roles, and, when necessary, overrides personal considerations. Insiders whisper that this moment forced that doctrine into the open once again, stripping away assumptions and placing reality in stark relief. Because while relationships may influence perception, they do not alter structure. And structure, in the monarchy, is everything. The narrative that began to take hold within internal circles was both simple and uncompromising. Duty over blood, and certainly over marriage. It was not a phrase publicly declared, but one that seemed to echo through the decisions being made. The legal frameworks that had been quietly constructed over decades were not designed to adapt to circumstance. They were designed to prevent it, to ensure that no matter the complexity of personal dynamics, the integrity of the institution would remain intact. And those frameworks, once activated, proved to be remarkably effective. Institutional safeguards, some visible, many not, began to assert themselves. Mechanisms that had long existed in the background now moved into focus, reinforcing boundaries that could not be crossed. These were not reactive measures. They were preventative by design, ensuring that the personal estate of the monarchy remained protected from any form of reinterpretation or diversion. At the same time, a quieter shift was taking place, one less visible, but equally significant. Power, in its most structured form, began to consolidate. Not dramatically, not through overt declarations, but through alignment. Core heirs, those whose positions were directly tied to the monarchy's continuity, found themselves increasingly central to the unfolding narrative. Their roles, already defined by lineage, now carried an added weight of responsibility to uphold the very structures that had just been reaffirmed. Within the palace, this shift was reportedly framed not as a confrontation, but as a correction, a necessary realignment that brought perception back into harmony with reality. There was no sense of triumph, no overt acknowledgement of victory or loss. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance that the system had functioned exactly as it was intended to, that the safeguards had held, that the principles, though tested, had not wavered. And perhaps most importantly, there was an understanding, unspoken but deeply felt, that this moment would not be the last of its kind, that the balance between personal relationships and institutional duty would continue to be tested in the years ahead. But for now, the line had been drawn, clearly, decisively, and without compromise. Because in the end, the monarchy does not bend to expectation. It does not reshape itself to fit circumstance. It endures by holding firm to the principles that define it, even when those principles demand difficult, deeply personal consequences. And with that principle firmly reasserted, the monarchy moved toward a new equilibrium. In the end, nothing was taken because it was never meant to be given. The legacy remained exactly where it had always been intended to stay. What once felt like a growing storm, fueled by uncertainty and quiet speculation, began to settle, not with a dramatic resolution, but with a quiet, almost inevitable clarity. The structures that had been questioned, examined, and ultimately reaffirmed did not collapse under pressure. They held. Reports suggest that as the dust began to settle within the palace, there was a collective recognition of something both simple and profound. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to. No sudden reversals, no emotional concessions, just a return to order. At the center of that order stood the carefully constructed estate of Queen Elizabeth II, untouched, unaltered, and preserved precisely as she had intended. Every directive, every clause, every sealed instruction had served its purpose. What had once been hidden beneath layers of legal language now stood revealed as a testament to foresight. Insiders whisper that this was never about exclusion, it was about preservation. A deliberate effort to ensure that the monarchy's most personal assets remained aligned with its deepest traditions, protected from reinterpretation, no matter how circumstances evolved. And with that preservation came stability. Not the kind that announces itself loudly, but the kind that settles quietly into place, restoring balance where tension once existed. The financial and legal systems that underpin the monarchy, often invisible to the public eye, resumed their steady rhythm. The uncertainty that had briefly disrupted their flow was replaced by something more familiar: structure, certainty, control. For Camilla, the outcome did not erase her presence, nor did it diminish her role in the visible sense. She remained queen. She remained part of the institution. But the understanding of that role had shifted, subtly yet permanently. It was no longer defined by assumption, but by clarity. Not expanded, but precisely outlined. And within that clarity, there was both limitation and definition: a quieter, more contained form of influence that existed within boundaries that could no longer be ignored. As these adjustments took hold, the monarchy itself began to emerge in a slightly different form. Not fundamentally changed, but refined, more structured, less ambiguous. The lines that define power, legacy, and entitlement had been redrawn not through conflict, but through recognition. And in that recognition, the institution found a renewed sense of identity, one that leaned more heavily on its foundational principles than on modern expectation. There was no celebration, no moment of triumph, just a gradual return to calm. Conversations softened, movements became less guarded. The tension that had once lingered in the background began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding that the moment had passed, but not without leaving its mark. Because those who had witnessed it, who had felt the weight of its implications, knew that something important had been revealed, something that could not be unseen. And perhaps that is where the true significance lies, not in what changed, but in what was confirmed. That beneath the evolving image of the monarchy, beneath the ceremonies and public narratives, there exists a framework that does not bend easily. A system built not just to endure, but to protect itself from within. Because in the House of Windsor, legacy is never accidental, it is engineered, protected, and, when necessary, fiercely defended. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.